When the SU-122 entered service in 1943, the Red Army finally acquired a self-propelled gun with enough firepower to engage virtually any battlefield target. Its powerful 122mm M30 howitzer was capable of destroying fortified positions, artillery emplacements, and infantry strongpoints, while also posing a serious threat to enemy armored vehicles. Even heavy tanks could suffer severe damage if struck by its large, high-explosive projectiles. Despite the vehicle's impressive capabilities, some Soviet designers began exploring ways to further increase its firepower. One proposal thought, well, if one is so good, why not mount two 122mm howitzers on a single chassis, doubling the vehicle's firepower? To investigate this concept, the OKB-172 Design Bureau at Plant No. 172 was asked with developing a new self-propelled gun based on the existing SU-122. The primary requirement was to retain as much of the original T-34-based design as possible, while introducing only those modifications absolutely necessary to accommodate the additional weapon. The resulting project received the designation SU-2-122. However, it quickly became apparent that the whole concept was fundamentally flawed. Installing two large howitzers within a vehicle based on a T-34 required extensive modifications to the fighting compartment, internal layout, and overall structure. These changes sort of defeated the purpose of creating a simple derivative of the SU-122. As a result, the project was abandoned at an early stage and never progressed beyond the drawing board. In the years preceding the outbreak of the Second World War, the Soviet Union focused primarily on producing large numbers of tanks. Although some resources were allocated to the development of self-propelled vehicles, such projects generally received lower priority. This situation changed dramatically following the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. After nearly a year of intense fighting, combat experience demonstrated the value of armored self-propelled guns, especially in providing direct fire support to advancing troops. As a result, Soviet authorities issued a requirement for a medium self-propelled assault gun. After evaluating a number of proposals and design concepts, Soviet planners selected the best one for mass production. The new vehicle combined the proven T-34 chassis with a newly designed armored superstructure that retained the T-34's characteristic sloped armor layout. Housed within this fighting compartment was a powerful 122mm M30 howitzer, capable of engaging fortified positions, artillery emplacements, and enemy armor. The vehicle entered service in the spring of 1943 under the designation SU-122. By this time, Soviet engineers already had some experience with multi-barreled tanks. One notable example was the KV-7 self-propelled gun, which initially sought to combine two 45mm guns with a single 76mm in a single vehicle. This was later revised to two 76mm guns, but the prototype still performed poorly. Another interesting example was the T-34-3 project, which proposed adding two additional 45mm guns and an extra crew member inside an enlarged T-34 turret. Thankfully, both of these designs were abandoned in late 1941. Roughly a year later, the concept of a multi-gunned armored vehicle resurfaced in the form of a proposed double-barreled assault gun based on the T-34 chassis. On December 16, 1942, Major General of Engineering and Artillery Forces A.A. Cholochkov, head of experimental projects within the Technical Council of the People's Commissariat of Armaments (NKV), outlined the requirements for a new self-propelled gun described as a paired 122mm howitzer based on the T-34 tank. According to Cholochkov and the NKV, the vehicle was intended to engage a wide variety of targets: fortifications, enemy troops, artillery positions, and even, under ideal circumstances, armored vehicles. The proposed armament consisted of two standard M30 122mm howitzers mounted side by side with only minimal modifications to the original guns. They were to be installed in a common mounting that allowed both independent and simultaneous firing. The recoil mechanisms and recuperators were to be protected by an external armored mantlet. The mount was supposed to provide an elevation range of +15 to -5 degrees, while horizontal traverse was expected to be between 15 and 20 degrees. Ammunition was stowed in such a manner to allow rapid firing and sustained rate of fire of 4 to 5 salvos per minute. Secondary armament was specified as 1 or 2 7.62mm DT machine guns. Protection was to consist of 70mm of frontal armor, 30mm on the sides, and about 15 to 20mm on the roof and rear. Despite these extensive requirements, the designers were instructed to retain the basic T-34 chassis and hull, with only minimal modifications. Responsibility for the development of the new vehicle was assigned to OKB-172 Design Bureau, part of Plant No. 172 in Molotov, modern-day Perm. OKB-172, formerly the Special Technical Bureau of the NKVD Directorate for the Leningrad region, was staffed largely by incarcerated specialists and former prisoners, most of whom had been drawn from Leningrad factories and research institutions. The project appears to have been a low priority within the Bureau, which was primarily tasked with improving existing artillery systems. As a result, active work on the twin-barrel self-propelled gun didn't really begin until spring of 1943. The design received the designation SU-2-122, reflecting both the caliber and the number of its guns. Technical documentation was completed on April 29, 1943, and the project was formally submitted to the NKV on May 12. The SU-2-122 was based on the chassis of the T-34, as ordered by the NKV. However, the fighting compartment had to be enlarged by 89 centimeters, which required the central portion of the hull to be lengthened and an additional road wheel to be added. To accommodate the two 122mm howitzers, the turret was replaced by a large rectangular casemate that spanned the full width of the hull. Inside the fighting compartment, additional fuel tanks were installed along the sides. The two guns were mounted at the front of the casemate. They were protected by a large armored mantlet. To the left of the guns was a vision slit for the left gunner, while on the right was a ball-mounted DT machine gun operated by the right gunner, who was also the commander. On the roof was a bolted plate for accessing the gun system, as well as two periscopes. The one on the left was attached to the guns and was capable of traversing, while the one on the right was a fixed PTK periscope that could only rotate in place. Toward the rear of the roof were two crew hatches of the same type used on the T-34, along with a large ammunition stowage box. This box partially covered the engine deck. To access the engine compartment, it had to be dismantled and removed, but only after the ammunition had been unloaded, of course. Aside from the lengthened hull and modifications to the running gear, where the first and last road wheels were rubber-rimmed and the four central ones were steel-rimmed, the hull remained largely identical to that of the T-34. The driver and bow machine gunner or radio operator positions were unchanged, as was the engine compartment, which housed the same V2 500 horsepower V12 diesel engine used in the T-34. The SU-2-122 was armed with two M30 122mm howitzers. This artillery piece entered service with the Red Army in 1939 as a towed weapon and remained in production until 1955. It formed a major component of the Soviet artillery arsenal throughout the Second World War and was widely exported post-war, with nearly 20,000 units produced. Within the SU-2-122, the two M30 howitzers were mounted in a large cradle fixed to the floor of the fighting compartment. The gun system could be aimed and operated by either the gunner or the commander, as both were provided with controls. However, it remains unclear whether any priority or override system existed, or whether coordination relied entirely on crew communication. While the two guns could not be traversed independently, they could be fired individually. To enable the installation of the main armament, their recoil distance had to be reduced to 85 centimeters, which in turn increased recoil resistance from 12 tons to 15.9 tons. This negatively affected firing accuracy, particularly when firing salvos with both guns simultaneously. To mitigate this issue, the use of recoil spades was proposed, but they were never fully designed or implemented. The M30 was capable of firing a wide range of ammunition, including high explosive, armor-piercing high explosive, and high explosive anti-tank, as well as shrapnel, smoke, chemical, and other specialized projectiles. The ammunition box at the rear of the casemate was used to store the main gun projectiles, while the propellant charges were stowed along the floor and sides of the fighting compartment. The estimated rate of fire was 4 to 5 salvos per minute, or 8 to 10 rounds per minute when firing alternately. The SU-2-122 had a crew of 6. In the fighting compartment were the commander, who also served as the gunner for the right-hand gun, the gunner for the left-hand gun, and 2 loaders. In the hull, the driver was seated on the left, with the bow machine gunner or radio operator on the right, same as on the T-34. The gunners were provided with seats attached directly to the gun mounts, while the loaders sat on seats mounted atop the side fuel tanks. Although the interior was relatively spacious, the absence of recoil guards posed a significant safety risk, as the recoiling howitzers could strike the loaders, especially when the guns were traversed to their maximum limits. The NKV never responded to the documentation submitted by the OKB-172 for the SU-2-122, effectively bringing the project to an immediate end. There were likely reasons for this ghosting, the primary one being that there was little practical need for such a vehicle. The single-barrel SU-122 had already fulfilled its intended role, and the need for anti-tank vehicles, not artillery, was becoming increasingly apparent. By the summer of 1943, efforts were already underway to upgun the SU-122 with the 85mm 52K anti-aircraft gun. In July 1943, the first prototypes of the SU-85 were completed, and the vehicle entered service the following month. Furthermore, in February 1943, before the SU-2-122 was even proposed, the SU-152 had already entered service. It mounted a massive 152mm gun on a proven, albeit still problematic chassis, while also offering superior protection. The SU-2-122 was therefore simply not needed. The project also suffered from a number of fundamental technical shortcomings. Accommodating two large 122mm howitzers within a vehicle based on the little T-34 chassis would require extensive modifications to the hull and fighting compartment, greatly increasing both development time and production costs. The proposed design was expected to weigh nearly 5 tons more than a standard T-34, which would have inevitably reduced mobility and placed additional strain on the vehicle's automotive components. There were also serious concerns regarding the practicality of the armament itself. No comparable armored vehicle armed with two large-caliber howitzers had ever been tested, leaving many questions unanswered. Issues such as recoil management, crew ergonomics, ammunition handling, and the synchronization of the two guns would likely have required extensive development work to resolve. Even then, there was no guarantee that the resulting vehicle would have even met expectations. Although the SU-2-122 was abandoned at an early age, the concept of double-barreled armored fighting vehicles did not disappear entirely within the Soviet Union. Later experimental projects, such as the ST-2 heavy tank and the so-called Bear project, continued to explore the idea of mounting multiple large-caliber guns on a single armored vehicle. Decades later, the concept would reappear in the form of the 2S-35 Kalatsya SV, which was initially developed with a twin-gun configuration. These vehicles, however, were conceived for very different purposes and emerged within entirely different technological and doctrinal environments. This concludes our video on the Soviet SU-2-122 project. Do you think its twin-gun armament had any real merit? Would it have genuinely increased the vehicle's firepower, or was it simply more trouble than it was worth? Let us know in the comments below. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to subscribe to stay updated on future content. If you'd like to contribute further, consider Patreon, PayPal, or our sister channel, Plain Encyclopedia. As always, we'd like to especially thank our medium and heavy tank Patreon supporters: Dan Fitzpatrick, Dave Shuford, Owen M., Ostrowski, R. Rob, and Sopwith21. Your generous contributions help fund our research, illustrations, and video production. Until the next time, keep us in your sights.